John Kennedy Howard, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
You were an elite cyclist who, among other things, competed in the Olympic Games and set a world speed record at the Bonneville Salt Flats. Can you tell us about your Bonneville speed record, and what was it like to be an elite Olympic level cyclist?
Well, that Olympic experience, which began in 1968, was really the kickoff for my cycling career. And it was a huge thrill and a huge honor to represent my country in the 1968 Olympics, and then again in Munich in 72, and finally 76 in Montreal, Canada. So yeah, it was a huge honor, as I said, and I have capitalized on that by let me begin a little bit earlier. When I started focusing on the bicycle speed record, it was sort of paying homage to those who had done it before, beginning with Charlie Murphy back in 1899, who went 60 miles an hour behind the Long Island Express train. And that was kind of a huge event in the day. They compared it with Lindbergh's crossing of the Atlantic. That's the sort of acclaim that Murphy, Mile a Minute Murphy, as he was later known, generated by doing that. And he nearly died in the process, but fortunately that didn't happen. And he became a hero after that and went on to 6-day fame. He was actually a New York City beat cop on a bicycle. But his career certainly took off, as did mine. And my focus back in the day was to break not Murphy's record, but Alan Abbott. There were several other participants in this. Two Frenchmen, Alph Letournier, and let's see, the second, I can't remember the second. I have to do my research on this, but what I did was break Dr. Alan Abbott's record on the Bonneville Salt Flats he set his in 1973. I was in 1985. We made 3 or 4 attempts at this when the salt was wet. When it rains out at Bonneville, it's a big lake, and it's impossible to make runs. It has to be thoroughly dry. So in that 3 years, we waited for Bonneville to completely dry out. And in the interim, we went to the San Felipe Highway in Baja, Mexico, and made several attempts there, but the roadway was a little too rough for the bicycle and the race car, and so we scrubbed that. We went 124 at the San Felipe location, but it was still short of Alan Abbott's 139 mile per hour record. So we still were committed to the process. So for those who don't have a clue as to what I'm talking about, the bicycle speed record is done in the wake of a racing car or motorcycle in some cases. And the car is equipped with a fairing, which essentially bores a hole through the wind. And that's how it's done. And you sit as close to the back of that car as you possibly can, and you go as fast as you possibly can. So that'll give you some idea of my history with the speed record and the Olympics as well.
You co-wrote a book with Rene Mauer, and it's titled The Black Cyclone, A Hero the World Forgot. Without spoiling too much about that book, what is it about, and what was it like to work with Rene on the book?
Well, Rene kept me honest on it. I will start at the beginning. Marshall Major Taylor was a boyhood hero of mine, and you know, heroes are important in sports and everyday manifestation of our existence. You really need to look at people to motivate, although motivation is internal. It really is important to have those heroes, and Taylor was my hero. We were both inducted into the U.S. Cycling Hall of Fame in 1989, same year, and I was starting to tell the story clear back in the 80s when I met Sydney Taylor Brown, his daughter, and I studied the character through his own autobiography. He's one of the very few sportsmen of the era who actually wrote an autobiography. And I read it cover to cover. I still have an original copy of that very rare book. And Rene realized that even though I could write and had written 5 books, that I was really too close to my subject matter, and she gave the story a little more of a dialogue, because it was clear that the 4 existing biographies on Taylor, none of them really gave him a voice, and that's what we wanted to do. We wanted he and his contemporaries to actually speak, rather than, we wanted a first person approach to telling the story, and that's exactly what we did. We wrote a biographical novel. And yes, there were plenty of gaps that had to be filled with dialogue. I think it's safe to say that I was true to history. I used all of the information in the biographies, and they were all excellent. I also went to many of the venues in Europe and Australia where Major Taylor had actually competed and had become a hero. Way before the world forgot him, he was the most recognizable, one of the most recognizable men in the world. And that's because cycling at the time in the 1890s was as big, if not bigger, than baseball. The same year, Major Taylor pulled down almost $50,000, which was an incredible amount of money in the time. I believe it was the Detroit Tigers baseball player Ty Cobb made all of $12,000. So you can see that the cyclists of the era were extremely well compensated, and they were heroes of the day. They were the sportsmen, and I have to say that's probably not necessarily a good thing, because cycling was dangerous. It was the era, post-industrial era, when bicycles were evolving into motorcycles, and they were still pedaled, but it would take tandem bicycles, and they would hang a little single-cylinder Didion Béton motor in the rear triangle of the tandem, and the stoker, as they were called, would stoke the tandem and operate the motor. Motors of the day were extremely finicky, so it was the job of the co-pilot, if you will, to operate the motor, and the captain would steer the bike. So those literally were the first motorcycles, and they, of course, later became, single operation. But those motors were first thought of, conceived, and designed to pace racing cyclists on velodromes or bicycle tracks. So when you pay homage to the internal combustion engines that became the future of our world practically in the form of motorcycles and of course automobiles, you have to understand the lineage of the bicycle, because this was the platform that gave rise to the motorcycle and the automobile. So I think that's important to point out historically. And that period of time was literally the mid 1890s up to about 1912, just before World War One. So as a historian, I see it as extremely relevant. And cycling was the king of sports worldwide for almost 40 years. Hope that answers some of your questions on that.
Yes, it does. I do have a couple of follow-up questions about your most recent book. And you kind of dwelled on this quite a bit in your response to the previous question, but in the late 19th century, cycling was one of the most popular sports, not just in the United States, but the developed world. And why did cycling have a golden age in America from about a decade or two after the Civil War or so to around 1900 or so?
Well, it was first of all, you have to understand that we were searching for all kinds of machinery after, I say post-industrial revolution, but the bicycle was a product of that era. The sewing machine, you could pick any cotton picking devices, any kind of machinery. It was high tech. Bicycles were high tech. They had experimented with all kinds of different forms of the high wheel bicycle, known as a penny farthing and high wheeler, the safety bicycle with double the wheels the same size. There were even recumbent bikes and a whole variety of bicycles that came out of that era. But all of them had one thing in common. They were initially labor-saving devices, and they essentially replaced the horse and buggy, as did the railroad train. But the first real manifestation of individual sports equipment was the bicycle, and they were immensely popular in the day, men and women. Women gave rise to the popularity, and there were almost as many women riding bicycles as men. And from that era, we have all of the evolution, as I mentioned, with the motorcycle, but it was profoundly dangerous because the tracks of the day were small. They were a lot of wooden tracks. Labor was cheap and they could build them. They were high banked and they were fairly short. Well, when you put a motorcycle on a track like that, you probably are going to have problems. And there were a host of problems. And there were incidents, a number of incidents where riders were killed, pacers were killed, spectators died. So you see, people came to the bike tracks to witness something that I would probably have to describe as early NASCAR. This was the exciting thing. Prior to that, the fastest vehicles were railroad trains and racehorses. So suddenly we have a whole new element of excitement in America. And Major Taylor was a big part of that. He was the American sprint champion in 1898 and then went on to win the world championship in 1899. But he did it in a way that was extremely difficult. He was African American, and he was discriminated against. And with the exception of Major Taylor, blacks were banned from bicycle racing. Um, and there were other sports that also banned black athletes. So every turn of the road for him, he faced racism. And he accomplished what he accomplished without teamwork. He was blazingly quick. He was a small man. He was about 5'6", 5'7", uh, and he had the ability to, because of his cycling acrobatic skills. He was trained that way. He trained himself actually to become a cycling uh, acrobat. And when he met his competition, it would not be unusual for, say, a third of the field that had qualified for the final of running through different heat races to get to the finals. But in the final, it would not be unusual at all for a third of the field to be riding not to win, but to make sure Taylor didn't win. And that happened way more than it should have. But in spite of that, he was so good that he would work his way through holes in the pack, and that's not an easy thing to do for anybody that's ever ridden in close competition with other riders. It's extremely difficult to do, and he did it. He managed it. But eventually, the overt racism got to him. He finally realized that he wasn't going to have that problem in Europe. He was far more accepted there, and he eventually signed a contract with Victor Briere, who was a French promoter. And initially, Briere had offered him what would have been $750,000 in today's money to just to have him race in Europe, but he turned the contract down for one reason. He was a Christian. He believed strongly and had promised his mother on her deathbed that he would never race on the Sabbath. And for most of his career, he held on to that. But eventually, he turned the tide in Europe. They wanted him so badly, and he did sign a contract for less money. But the clause was that they would change the days of the racing. Instead of Sunday racing, which was what they did. They went to the opera on Saturday. They watched bicycle racing on Sunday. But they changed that. The entire structure of bicycle racing in Europe changed to meet Major Taylor's demands. So he was a huge celebrity, eventually surpassed all of the top sprinters in Europe. That didn't start that way, but it's a long sea voyage, and finally he got his legs, and when he did, he was literally unbeatable.
I'm going to move on to about how your book was published. Is the Black Cyclone independently, traditionally, or hybrid published?
I'd probably refer to it as Vanity Press is sort of the catch-all on that one. I would say that if probably if we had a Simon and Schuster or a Penguin Random House behind it, the book would probably be better known. As it is an Amazon bestseller, and I'm very proud of that. But I think book needs a more acclaim, and Aaron, I definitely appreciate your assistance in creating that. Thank you very much. Rene and I wanted to get the book out, and because I had spent the better part of embarrassingly long time of over 30 years writing the book, but it gave me the opportunity to interview Sydney Taylor Brown, who was in her 80s at the time and still recalled a great deal about her father. And I'm probably one of the very few authors who's had that opportunity. So that was one of the reasons Rene and I decided to change the format and do a biographical novel as opposed to just a straight biography. So we got good support from Dorrance Publishing, but again, I think a broader base of readership would be created by a larger publisher, frankly.
Normally, I don't end an interview talking about asking a question, rather about books that an author has written, but you've written 5 other books, and all of them, I believe, are nonfiction, if I'm not mistaken. The Cyclist's Companion, Multi-Fitness, Pushing the Limits, Dirt, and Mastering Cycling. Without spoiling too much about each of those books, what are each of them about, and are they all out of print, or some or none of them out of print?
Oh, I think all but the Cyclist's Companion are probably out of print. They're available. I've seen them on various sources like eBay. The Cyclist's Companion was one of the very first cycling books out, clear in the early '80s, and it sort of defined the equipment and all of the various ingredients one needs in terms of health and fitness. Let's see. Dirt was a mountain bike book, the philosophy, technique, and practice of mountain biking. The Pushing the Limits was a biography. Well, I guess I could call it an autobiography. Peter Nye and I co-wrote it. Pete is a cycling historian, and the Cyclist. Let me see. I mean, I actually have a copy of Mastering Cycling here. This is a how-to book on everything that's currently important about bicycle setup and so forth. So yeah, it's a book that you would get if you were just getting into the sport and you wanted to learn a little bit more about the minutia of equipment and health and fitness, and all of this material was a series of articles that I wrote for a number of different publications, and I finally put the package together, culminating all of those articles. So that's essentially what Mastering Cycling is about. Yeah, the Black Cyclone, totally new approach.
John, it is an honor to have interviewed you. I thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast, and you were an amazing guest to interview.
Well, thank you, Aaron. I greatly appreciate hearing that. I hope I can continue to inspire others to do what I've done and enjoy the process. You know, cycling is a healthy sport as long as you can keep it safe, and I would like everybody to experience, either in a gym or on the road, this magnificent sport of cycling.
This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.